All right, hi everyone. This is the second of our videos on how to write up your final paper, and this one will focus on running the analyses and getting the results and the discussion. And so you should have watched and hopefully written your method section by now and be pretty firm on what we did. So the first step of running our analyses is making sure that we understand and are comfortable with our data. So remember that we're all analyzing the data for the happiness dependent variable. And we showed people pictures, 4 pictures, and for each picture, we asked them to rate how well they think the following traits describe this person. And the 3 traits that assessed happiness were joyous, glad, and cheerful. And so they rated these traits on a scale of 1, which was very poorly, to 5, which was very well. And so when we look at these and we think about it, that means that a low score would mean that they perceive the person as less happy, and a high score would mean that they perceive the person as more happy. But we have 3 different items for each one of the pictures. And of course, we want to combine it into one happiness score. So the way we're going to do that is get a mean score for the 3 items for each picture. So we're going to average perceptions of joyous, glad, and cheerful for each one of the 3 pictures, get a mean to create a composite variable so that for each picture, we have a general happiness score. The next thing we need to do is clean the data. So we've talked about this and we've talked about data analysis, but we want to make sure to check for errors such as misleading or impossible values. We want to look at the range for each of the condition and compare it to the possible responses. So I'm going to actually show you the analyses. So this is the program that we use. It's called SPSS. We have 2 different views, but in this view, each row across is an individual's data and their response to every question. So I'm going to go ahead and analyze. We're going to get some descriptive statistics. And we want to do the descriptive statistics for happiness. So we want to know the descriptive statistics for happiness for each one of our 4 faces. So the FA indicates female attractive, female unattractive, male attractive, male unattractive. So if I say, okay, SPSS is going to spit out this output. And what it tells me, the N is how many participants we have that data for. The minimum for each one is 1 and the maximum is 5. That's good. That's within the scale that we asked them to respond. So if we saw a score of 10 or 8, that will be a red flag, but they're all within the range. We have our mean right here for each score. So this is the mean happiness for the female attractive face. This is the mean happiness for the female unattractive face, and so on. We also have the standard deviation for each one of those. Okay, so we have kind of checked to confirm that the values are looking like we expect them to look and what we'd like to see. So the next step is going to be summarizing the data. And the best way to do this is put it in a table. So I've actually created the table for you with that data that you just saw from SPSS. So this is going to be the first table in your paper. We have our 2 our 2 independent variables. You've got physical attractiveness, attractive and unattractive, and then photogender, male and female. This is the mean, and then the number in parentheses is the standard deviation. The next step, if you remember from our data analysis stuff, is confirming what the data revealed. This is called the hypothesis testing component. Now, you don't need to know the details of the analyses. The analyses we're doing are a 2x2 repeated measures ANOVA. We haven't talked about this in detail. I just want you to be able to interpret the outcome, so don't worry too much about this, but just so you know, the 2x2, remember when we talked about complex designs, the first 2 is our first independent variable, attractiveness, which has 2 levels. By 2, our second independent variable is gender, also has 2 levels. They're repeated measures because every participant rates every one of the pictures. And then the analytic test is called an ANOVA. So let me just show you what this looks like. And again, you don't need to worry too much about the details, but I want you to see the analyses being run just so you can kind of see how this is. If we were in the classroom, I would have you actually do it yourself. We are going to go to Analyze, General Linear Model, and it is repeated measures. And these are within subjects factors. So the first one is photo gender, and we've got 2 levels of that, and then photo attractiveness, and we've got 2 levels of that. And so we say add and define. So now we're going to figure out which happiness scores goes in each one. So we can say that photo gender, when photo gender equals 1, it indicates female. And when photo gender equals 2, it indicates male. So this is female attractive, female unattractive, male attractive, male unattractive. And we're going to go ahead and say okay. And so there's a lot that comes out in this output. And I will break it down for you, and a lot of it is repetition. You don't need to really understand the details too much, but the things we're really looking at, what this analysis, the ANOVA, gives you is the 2 main effects and the interaction term. So it also has an error term, which you don't need to worry about, but here is the main effect of photo gender, this line right here. Here is the main effect of photo attractiveness, and then this is the interaction between the 2. And what we're looking at is the p-value. So if you remember with our null hypothesis testing, we want a small p-value of less than 0.05 to indicate that it's significant. SPSS calls the p-value sig. It's the same thing. So if we look at this, we're looking for a p-value of less than 0.05. For photo gender, our p-value is 0.00. That is significant. For our main effect of photo attractiveness, our p-value is 0.007, still less than 0.05, so that is significant. And then our interaction term is also highly significant. So if we come back here, I have listed kind of what needs to go into your paper, which is the main effect of attractiveness, gender, and the interaction. You're going to put the F value, which you don't need to be able to interpret, but it's just the statistic that you list, and the P value in your paper for each of the main effects and the interaction term. Okay. And what you're going to need to do is interpret the results. So we need to interpret what's happening with the main effect of attractiveness and what's happening with the main effect of gender, and then also what's happening with the interaction. And of course, the way we learn to kind of interpret the interaction is to graph it. And so some of this is new, but if you go back to complex designs, how we talked about interpreting main effects and interaction, this is what you're doing just with real data. Okay, so if we're going to interpret the main effects, if we want to interpret the main effect of gender, we want to know the difference between males and females. You have this table that has the means. This is just like the other complex designs tables that you've seen. And so we can go through and get the mean ratings of happiness for male and the mean ratings of happiness for females. And we're going to compare these numbers in order to interpret the main effect of gender. It looks like the male photos were perceived as more happy than the female photos. Likewise, if we want to know how to interpret the main effects of attractiveness, we're going to compare the attractive photos to the unattractive photos and take the average across. And we're going to compare these 2 numbers. And so it looks like the unattractive photos were rated as more happy than the attractive photos. But of course, we also had a significant interaction effect. And so this is kind of interesting. So we have our dependent variable, which is happiness over here. And then we have one independent variable, physical attractiveness. And then the other one is gender over here. And so what you can see is the attractive pictures were identical for males and females. But for males, the unattractive individual was rated as more happy than the attractive individual, whereas for females, the unattractive individual was rated as less happy than the attractive individual. So this interaction effect almost kind of supersedes the two main effects, because what it tells us is we can't just talk about the effects of gender without talking about attractiveness. Likewise, we can't just talk about overall effects of attractiveness, because whether attractiveness makes someone appear more or less happy really depends on their gender. Okay, so those are the results, and now you need to write them up in your results section. And essentially what you're doing when you write your results section is describing each analysis that was completed. You're listing the results and describing in terms of the variables that you studied. So you need to make sure that you are talking about how the variables you studied are related. So kind of making it something that's understandable. And you'll also need to include references to the table and figure. Okay, so the first thing that you are going to talk about are the descriptive statistics for each variable. I've given you the tables, so you need to list the mean and standard deviation for each condition. Talk about where they fall in terms of the response scale. So remember that is a scale from 1 to 5. In the methods video and PowerPoint, I've shown you exactly what the responses are. So you might talk about, were these pictures on average perceived to be very happy or not very happy or somewhere in the middle? Next, you're going to talk about our analysis confirming what the data reveal. Now, we generally start by talking about the interaction effect first, because the interaction effect kind of supersedes those main effects. So first, you want to talk about whether there was a significant interaction effect. For our case, there was. So you're going to list the F and the p-value. So I've given you an example of how you might write it up. Something like there was a significant interaction between photo, gender, and physical attractiveness in predicting happiness, and you'll list the F and the p-value. It's also very important, though, that you don't end it there, but that you describe the interaction, explain the pattern that you see in the graph. So how does physical attractiveness influence perception of happiness for the female pictures? How does it change perceptions of happiness for the male pictures? As you're describing this, refer to the figure. So somewhere in the text you need to say, see figure 1. And you will include the figure, you'll copy and paste it out of the PowerPoint at the end of your paper. Okay, you also though need to talk about whether there are significant main effects for either one. You're going to report the significant main effects of photo gender, and you're going to describe the relevant means and report the F and the p-value. So something like male photos were rated as significantly more happy than female photos, likewise for physical attractiveness. For the main effects, you want to refer to the table. So somewhere in there, you're going to need to say, see table 1, and include the table at the end of your paper. And again, you can copy and paste from the PowerPoint for that. Okay, so the results section are really pretty straightforward. It's going to be it should be about a page is what I'm expecting for that. And really you're just writing down the results that we found. The discussion section is going to take a little more thinking, because the goal is really to draw conclusions about your results. So the very first thing you do, that first paragraph of the discussion section, should be a summary of what you found. You don't include any numbers in the discussion section, just describe in words what you found and how this fit with what you expected to find. Now, some of you didn't form specific hypotheses about happiness. You can kind of write this response of whether it fit with your expectations based on just your kind of casual observations and expectations. You don't have to go back and create specific hypotheses about happiness. You'll keep your introductions as they were with my revisions. You don't need to go back and rewrite those. Okay, so the next section, the next paragraph or two for your discussion section, once you've briefly summarized the findings, is how do you explain it? So for this section, you really need to take a step back and go beyond just describing the variables that we studied in that specific context. And I want you to think about what type of processes might be driving the relationship. Here, everything was significant, but if you didn't have significant findings, you'd also need to explain that. So why might the unattractive man be perceived as more happy while the unattractive woman is perceived as less happy? So you're thinking about broader things, societal expectations, messages from the media, whatever you can think of that might explain these differences based on gender and attractiveness. And then the final section of your discussion, well, actually, it's not the final section. Next is going to be your limitations and future directions. So think about what are potential weaknesses of the study. Are there any confounding variables that could have affected the results? Go back and look at the questions that were asked. Look at the materials, the pictures that we used. Think about how we recruited our sample or any of these things potential weaknesses. And if you could redo the study with unlimited time and resources, what would you have changed? And then also kind of, you can combine this or have it a separate paragraph. What directions should future research take? So here I'm thinking not so much of redoing our exact study, but what are the bigger questions still left? So we found this interaction with regard to perceptions of happiness. What does it suggest about the halo effect? And what are the other things we need to study with regard to the halo effect? And then the final section will be your conclusion. So you should have kind of one final paragraph that really takes a step back. Why is the study important? Kind of what's the takeaway message you want your reader to get? And how is this study relevant to everyday life? So that is going to be kind of how you write up your results and discussion section. And I will post a final video helping with some of the formatting and issues that you may have.